compulsion of the static. The sun rose, casting weak, city-stained light into the apartment. With the dawn came a fragile sense of normalcy. The terror of the night before receded, leaving behind a residue of unease and a throbbing curiosity. Leo, running on adrenaline and caffeine, convinced himself he had experienced a perfect storm of sleep deprivation and psychological suggestion. The human brain was a pattern-seeking machine, and his was a high-performance model, tuned specifically to find meaning in noise. He had found a shocking image, and his mind had provided a suitable, terrifying soundtrack and visual accompaniment. But the frame was real. That was the undeniable, empirical fact at the center of it all. He spent the morning methodically, obsessively, documenting his find. He took a dozen screenshots of frame 25 from slightly different enhancements. He ran audio analysis on the segment, isolating the exact moment he zoomed in. The waveform was flat, dead. There was no whisper, no hidden audio track. According to the data, the only sound had been the cheerful, tinny orchestra of the cartoon. The whisper existed only in the subjective, non-quantifiable space of his own perception. This should have been a relief. It was proof it was all in his head. It was. It made it worse. Because if the whisper wasn't in the file, then where was it? He avoided looking at reflections. He kept his back to the wall. The apartment, his sanctuary, now felt like a set of a play where the scenery could change between acts. He found himself staring at the dark screen of his turned-off television, at the black glass of his microwave door, at anything that could potentially show him what was behind him. He was constantly, subtly, straining his neck, trying to see his own blind spot. By the afternoon, the compulsion won. He had to look again. He had to see if it would happen a second time. This was the core of the obsession, not just the discovery, but the replication of the phenomenon. He needed to confirm the rules. He opened the video file again. His hand was steadier now, his mind more clinical. He was a scientist observing a strange new species of phenomenon. He navigated directly to the timestamp, 0604. He advanced, frame by frame, 21, 22, 23, 24. There it was, frame 25, the scream. His breath caught again, but this time it was a mix of dread and a scholar's excitement. The face was just as horrifying as he remembered. The sheer artistry of the despair was chilling. It wasn't a cartoonish scream of surprise. It was the scream of a soul being unmade. He took a deep breath. Test 1. He moved his cursor over the face and zoomed in. The software rendered the enlarged pixels. The grain swam, and the whispering returned. It was louder this time. Still faint, still layered and sibilant, but he could almost make out a word. It sounded like see or see. It was a wet, breathy sound, as if the speakers were right beside his ears. He kept his eyes locked on the screen, refusing to turn around. The whisper was not in the room. It was in the interface. Test 2. This was the hard part. He moved his cursor to the pause button. His finger hovered over the mouse. He was acutely aware of the space behind him. He could feel it, a pressure against his back. He closed his eyes for a second, steeling himself, then clicked. Silence. The video froze. The whispering stopped abruptly, cut off as if a switch had been thrown. Slowly, deliberately, he forced his eyes to shift from the screaming face to the black border of the monitor, to his own reflection. And there it was, the dark shape. It was closer this time. It no longer stood directly behind his chair, but just over his right shoulder, leaning in as if to look at the screen with him. It was still a formless silhouette, a cutout of a man, but its proximity was intimate, violating. He could feel a phantom coldness radiating from the spot where it stood. He did not spin around. He knew the drill now. He kept his gaze locked on the reflection, on the thing sharing his space. He counted to 10, his heart a trapped bird beating against his ribs. On 10, he blinked. In the instant his eyes were closed, he felt a shift. When he opened them, the shape was gone. The reflection showed only his own pale, wide-eyed face and the empty room. He exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. It was real. The phenomenon was repeatable, predictable. Zoom in on the face, get the whisper. Pause the video, and the reflection shows a visitor. It was a ritual, a terrible, secret ritual. This became his new routine. For days, he lived inside this loop. He would work up the courage, open the file, zoom, listen, pause, and look. Each time, the whispering seemed to gain a fraction of clarity. The layered voices began to separate. He started to distinguish them. A high, reedy voice, a low, guttural one, a frantic, chattering one. They were still speaking nonsense, fragments of sounds that almost formed words. The edge, not long, opened the... And each time he paused, the dark shape in the reflection was different. It was no longer a uniform smudge. On the third day, it had what looked like a long, thin limb raised, as if pointing at the screen. On the fourth day, its head, or the space where a head should be, was cocked at an unnatural, inquisitive angle. On the fifth day, it had developed a suggestion of features: 2 shallow depressions where eyes might be, and a darker gash that could be a mouth. It was learning to resolve itself, to become more defined through his observation. He stopped leaving his apartment. He called in sick to his part-time job at the university library. Food was delivered and left mostly uneaten by the door. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of his screen and the terrifying theater of the reflection. He was mining the frame, and with each excavation, he was bringing something back to the surface. He began to research the face. Who was this man? He dove into the history of the animation studio, a small, long-defunct outfit called Flickering Pictures, Inc. He tracked down the names of the animators, the voice actors, the janitors. He found a fire registry from 1931 that showed the studio's archive had been mostly destroyed. He found obituaries. One name stood out: Alistair Finch, a cell painter known for his meticulous, almost photorealistic character sketches. He had died in a sanitarium in 1935. The listed cause was nervous exhaustion. A forum post from a historical society mentioned Finch was rumored to have been working on a secret project, something the studio heads had deemed too intense for audiences. Too intense. Leo looked at the screaming face. It was certainly that. He became convinced the face was Alistair Finch. This was no longer a random, anomalous frame. It was a message. A scream for help sent through time, trapped in a film can for nearly a century. He felt a connection to the man, a shared obsession that transcended the decades. He was no longer just a researcher. He was a participant. 1 week after the initial discovery, he conducted his nightly ritual. He zoomed. The whispers were clearer than ever. They were no longer a chaotic overlay. One voice, the low, guttural one, was dominant. Find the others, it rasped, the words slithering out from the hiss. Leo's blood ran cold. Others. He paused the video. His eyes snapped to the reflection. The shape was no longer a shape. It was a man. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in what looked like a laboratory coat from a previous century. His skin was pale and waxy, his hair a wild, unkempt mane. And his face was contorted in the exact same scream as the man in frame 25. It was Alistair Finch, or a ghost wearing his skin. But the most horrifying part was not the scream. It was the eyes. They were wide with terror, yes, but they were locked not on the screen, not on Leo, but on the reflection itself. The thing in the reflection was staring, screaming, at its own reflection in a terrifying, infinite regression. And in its long, bony fingers, it was holding something. A small, rectangular, black object. A film can. Leo stared, transfixed, for a full minute. The entity in the reflection did not move, did not blink. It was a frozen tableau of perpetual horror. Then slowly, Leo's eyes, drawn by a terrible magnetism, drifted from the screaming face in the reflection to the space behind the reflection. In the deep, warped darkness of the monitor's glass, beyond the image of his room and the spectral visitor, he saw something else. It was faint, like a city skyline seen through thick fog. It was a room, but not his room. It was an old-fashioned animation studio. He could see a discarded light table, scattered cells, and on a far wall, a series of film strips hanging like sinister party decorations. The reflection was no longer just a reflection. It was a window, and the window was opening wider. He slammed his laptop shut. The image vanished. He was panting, sweat soaking his t-shirt. The apartment was silent. The hum of the computers was gone. In his panic, he had knocked the power strip loose with his foot. He sat in the sudden, profound silence. The afterimage of the screaming man burned onto his retinas. The whisper echoed in his mind. Find the others. He knew, with a certainty that felt like a sentence of death, that this was not the end. It was the end of the beginning. Alistair Finch had not been screaming in a vacuum. He had been screaming at something he had seen in his own frame, in his own reflection. He had hidden a piece of a larger puzzle inside the jolly jamboree, and Leo had found it. And now, the thing that had driven Finch to a sanitarium was inviting Leo to continue the work. The obsession was complete. He was no longer digging for treasure. He was digging his own grave, and the whispers were his cheerleaders. He had to find the others. There was no other choice.